I'm Dr. Susan Eyrich, and welcome to this conservation conversation. These conversations are designed to contemplate our collective journey together and how best we can find and then maintain our individual paths. The ultimate goal is action arising from a shift in perception that all life is sacred, and creating a community of practice that grows and supports each other through our actions. We're delighted you're here. It is my honor to have you here, David. Not just an eminent Buddhist scholar and teacher, but a rare thing, a Buddhist scholar and activist, and in my mind, a really, really, really clear thinker. So thank you for coming to me.
Thank you for those kind words. It's interesting about the activist side in particular. Back in the 60s, I was a draft resistor against the Vietnam War, and much more recently this year, I've joined Extinction Rebellion and some of the other local groups here that are talking very seriously about direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience, because it's really looking as if we need to do something like that to hold politicians' feet to the fire and really move toward the kind of declaration or admission of climate emergency, ecological emergency that we really need to consider.
I was hoping to get to that sometime in the conversation. So if we could start,
Sure.
But I want to be sure to get to that.
I didn't mean to jump ahead, but
no,
yeah,
no, it's fine. Because in the end, the whole point of all of this is what action can we take? And how can we be supported in it? But one of the special elements of having you here is that you have the Buddhist perspective of how it can help us wake up and respond. So that's one element. Another element is that, as you point out, so the name of David's book is Ecodharma, and it's wonderful and you should get it. And he can explain in a minute in his own words what Ecodharma is. But he's talking about that we might need we do need unwavering attention to the current crisis, but a big mistake we are going to make, or might make, is thinking that, I'm going to read his actual words from his introduction here, because many people assume if we can just convert quickly enough to renewable sources of energy, our economy and society continue to function indefinitely in much the same way. We need to realize that climate change is merely the proverbial tip of the iceberg, the most urgent symptom of a predicament that has more profound implications. And that urgent predicament is our worldview, how it means that we just think the earth is there for us to use. A beautiful sentence he says is, the irony is that we become so obsessed with exploiting and abusing our actual treasure, a flourishing biosphere with healthy forests and topsoil, lakes and oceans full of marine life, an unpolluted atmosphere. We're obsessed with that in order to maximize something that has no value at all, digital numbers and bank accounts.
which is to say money. Yeah.
Right. And then the last part, for me, the most important things that I would like to cover today is that at the core, as you said, it's not just stopping global warming, it's stopping our entire way of observing of how we see the world. And we're in this because it's a collective spiritual crisis and a potential turning point in our history. So if you'd like to address all that in 2 minutes or less.
Well, maybe I can say a few things. Yes. I mean, you've seized on the first main point that the book makes, which is that, yes, global change, climate change or global warming, these, and they're kind of euphemisms for something that might be better spoken of as sort of climate emergency. But urgent as they are, huge as they are, nonetheless, they really just are the tip, a very big tip, but a tip of a much larger iceberg that has to do with our whole relationship with the earth. I mean, there are many, many other ecological things going on. If you look at what's going on with, well, I suppose the one that stands out maybe most of all is extinction event. We seem to be well into the Earth's 6th extinction event, in this case, caused by us, caused by our activity, by our greed. E.O. Wilson, the renowned Harvard biologist, has at one time estimated that by the end of this century, up to half of all plant and animal species could be extinct or will be so weakened that they would go extinct thereafter. I mean, that's just amazing, you know. So, and I think that's important to remember. Sometimes people think, well, if we destroy ourselves, well, we've done it to ourselves, but we're taking a lot of the biosphere with us. And there's so many other things we could talk about in terms of plastics, polluting everything, all kinds of toxic chemicals in the air, the water, the earth, our bodies. I mean, one can go on and on and on. But what it really does do is raise this much broader question. It's not simply a matter of transforming to renewable sources of energy, which we know, of course, is necessary and urgent, but it raises this much larger question about our relationship with the earth. Is the earth here as something for us to exploit, a kind of convenience store, or simply a bag of resources for us to use any way we want? Or what does it mean to realize that we're part of the earth, that we are one of its manifestations, that our species is one of the ways that the earth creates itself? So, I mean, I think that's something that really needs to be foreground at the very beginning. Yeah. Now, what was your next question to be addressed in 2 minutes, or how would you like to follow up to that?
You take your time. So, what is the Buddhist perspective on all this, and how can a Buddhist perspective help with all this?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that needs to be emphasized is, in one way, there's no such thing as Buddhism. There's a lot of different kind of Buddhist traditions which overlap, as you would imagine, but it can't be reduced to one point of view. And none of those were things that developed in response or at the time of an ecological crisis. What I mean by that is we can't go back to early Buddhist teachings and sort of read off some simple response. I mean, the Pali Canon, the earliest teachings we have, they're not going to tell us what to do. So one has to be somewhat creative in the way that we understand those teachings and how they might be applied to our situation today. One thing that is really important, though, is every time Buddhism has gone to a new culture, it has exemplified its own emphasis on impermanence, right? I mean, Buddhism emphasizes in the beginning, everything's changing all the time, and that applies to Buddhism itself. So when Buddhism goes to a new culture, it transforms radically as it interacts with it. And the situation that we're in now, in one way, it's the most extreme example, but it's not a new challenge for Buddhism in the sense that this is what Buddhism has always done. It's needed to sort of interact and reconstruct itself to meet the new situation, which in our case is secular, materialistic, consumerist modernity, a now global civilization that does seem to be in the process of self-destructing. Now, having said all that, let me mention 2 things that for me really stand out. The first is what I see as a kind of fascinating parallel between what Buddhism says about our individual predicament, one way of understanding that, and our collective predicament today, right? It's like Buddhism can be understood in different ways, of course, but certainly within the tradition that I practice, which is Japanese Zen, what's emphasized most of all, I think, is the delusion of a separate self. The delusion that there's a me somehow inside, behind my eyes, inside the ears, looking out at an external objective world that's separate from me, right? which also implies that somehow my well-being is therefore separate from your well-being or the well-being of everyone else. And for Buddhism, that's a delusion. That sense of separation is a fundamental delusion, not just a delusion, but a delusion that causes suffering. Because this so-called separate self doesn't have any reality of its own. It's not self-existing. It's all of our selves, all of our senses of self are really the result of the way things sort of interact. We're interdependent with everything, but insofar as we feel separate, we're inevitably going to feel insecure, uncomfortable, or as I call it, we're going to have the sense of lack, because that so-called self that we have isn't real. It doesn't have any independent existence. So on that basis, one can say, okay, that's one way to understand what Buddhism is always talking about. But wait a minute, what about our present situation now? Is there a collective parallel in relationship to the earth? Can we say that we, as human beings, as a now global civilization, have we created a sense of separate self that feels separate from the rest of the earth? Mm. And is there a dukkha, or that's the old word for suffering? Is there a suffering involved in that? In other words, one way to understand, one way to extrapolate or sort of reflect on the traditional teachings is to see how Buddhism would also make a critique of our sense of separation from the earth. So that's one thing that the book goes into detail. There's a whole chapter on kind of elaborating that parallel. The other thing that really stands out for me, and frankly, Susan, I wonder if this is the most important thing that Buddhism may have to offer today, is especially emphasized in later Mahayana Buddhism, the idea of the Bodhisattva path. And what that means is the notion that one shouldn't practice Buddhism simply for your own liberation, your own enlightenment, your own peace of mind, but that actually, if we really understand what's going on, we're practicing in order to help everyone wake up, in order to work for the well-being of the whole. And I think you can see how that fits in with what I said earlier. Insofar as we begin to wake up in Buddhism, we begin to realize our non-duality. This sense of separation dissipates. And if that's true, then we naturally feel concern for the well-being of other people, and indeed the biosphere as a whole. But what's interesting about the Bodhisattva idea is that it combines these two sides. The Bodhisattva, or Ecosattva, as some of us now like to talk about it, the Ecosattva, she continues to work on her own liberation, her own awakening in the Buddhist sense, overcoming the sense of separation, but also realizes that that's not enough, that it's important also to use whatever equanimity, whatever emptiness, whatever insight comes from that, and go out in the world and thereby be able to be more engaged socially and politically and ecologically in the world. So it's like, maybe the best way to say it is that unlike the way some people understand Buddhism, where the real practice is, say, meditation and going out and becoming engaged as a kind of a distraction from that, what I think real Mahayana Buddhism is emphasizing is rather we have two sides, that our engagement in the world is just as much a form of practice, spiritual practice. And again, I'm talking in Buddhist terms, but you could change the vocabulary. That's fine. You can apply it to a lot of other spiritual traditions, but so that there's these two aspects to practice. We have our own personal contemplative life, our own spiritual life, but we also realize that comes to fruition, that flourishes, that becomes most meaningful when out of that equanimity, out of that spiritual sustenance, we're able to go into the world and do the best we can to address what's happening in the world. And there's a lot of details about that the book talks about, but the one in particular I want to end with is the idea that our task today really seems to be that we need to do the best we can, not knowing if anything we do makes any difference whatsoever. Mm-hmm. It's like in a way, we can't know that But again, for someone rooted in a kind of spiritual practice, they can do that, you know, acting without attachment to the results. In other words, we don't know what's going to happen, but in a way, this is our gift to the earth. This is what we're called upon to do. And I think this, as I said earlier, I think this understanding, this way of understanding the Bodhisattva or Ecosattva path, maybe that's the most important thing that Buddhism has to contribute today. I wonder. Yeah.
Just a quickie definition for people who might not know what a Bodhisattva is.
So again, a Bodhisattva is somebody traditionally who would be practicing Buddhism. And as I said, they would be working, meditating, working on their own, following the path. But they realize that that's not enough, that they use that practice to go out and help everybody else as well. Now, traditionally, the focus would have been helping individuals, especially, say, Buddhist teachers helping students or so forth. But today, I think many of us have the sense that that's broadening up, that it's not, that we need to continue that kind of service, but we also need to look at kind of the social structures, the institutions, the institutionalized greed that we find, say, sometimes with our economic system, or our institutionalized ill will, such as our militarism or our attitude toward undocumented immigrants or prisoners, that kind of thing. Yeah.
One of the things that I think is interesting is now more and more people are sensing the emergency, and there are more and more demonstrations. How can Buddhism help keep those demonstrations effective, rather than devolving into too much rage, in which case then you get a backlash? Stay grounded in our spirituality without being gentle, but without being weak? How do we find that balance? It's going to be very risky these times now, because we are so enraged and it is so urgent. It's easy to activate the more radical, in a negative sense, radical aspects of ourselves, and then have a negative reaction. And that is simply not as effective. I mean, there are people who've been pacifistic and effective, as Gandhi and other people. So any thoughts you have on that?
Well, the real task, isn't it? Can we have an activism grounded in love and compassion rather than anger or rage at what's happening? I mean, actually, I think there's a role for anger, not hatred, but a role for anger. Anger fundamentally is a kind of energy. And if we know how to use it rather than being used by it, I think it can be sometimes very powerful. Buddhism from the very beginning emphasizes nonviolence. I mean, the very first precept of Buddhism has always been non-harming, non-violence. And unlike the Abrahamic traditions, there's the emphasis that applies to all sentient beings or all breathing beings. I think that's the literal translation. So there's a lot of emphasis on non-violence. And again, I think it goes back to this double-sided practice of the Bodhisattva. If your activism is grounded in some kind of spiritual practice that develops equanimity, then that helps us keep the kind of equanimity when we're actually engaged in activities in the world. In other words, I think if we're grounded in some kind of meditative practice, for example, it's much easier to avoid some of the anger and the rage that otherwise people might get gripped by. Yeah.
And lead us astray. So a little bit more with what you started with earlier about activism, why you're an activist, how you're an activist, and then we can open it to everyone else.
Well, you know, it's early days here. Even since I finished writing the book, I mean, it was published in January, but it was finished well over a year before that. I think there's been some really significant shift in consciousness that's happened. Just within the last year. Well, for one thing, the IPCC came out with this well-known report. We only have 12 years left for starting to seriously address carbon levels. And the IPCC is a pretty conservative organization in general. I mean, it's the UN, it's all the countries have to work together and sign off. It's not a radical organization. So, when I hear them say that, they're being conservative in the sense of it may actually be quite a bit worse than that. But what I think is happening is a lot more people are waking up to the fact that things are more difficult, more dangerous, further along than we realized. And secondly, I also get the sense that more and more people are realizing that we can't depend on the present political economic system to respond adequately. I call it one system because there are two sides to it, right? It's really two sides to the same, the economic and the political, because the people at the top of the one tend to be the people, they're all part of the same elite. And we have this fundamental problem, I think, that the people who benefit most from the present system are the people who control the present system. And, it's worked for them. And sure, they can see there's a climate crisis or whatever, but they're not going to, the tendency will not be to really engage in the kind of radical changes that really seem to be becoming necessary. So that leads to the third thing that I see happening. And just in the last few months, I'm really struck. It's not only Extinction Rebellion, this group that's been closing down central London this week. And, we have a founding group here in Denver and many, many other places around the world. But 350.org, we had a training for nonviolent direct action. Other groups are doing the same. It's just striking to see that more and more people are starting to feel the urgency is so great. The present system, as it's going along, is not going to be able to address it unless we do something radical. And I would say put our bodies in the line with something like nonviolent direct action in order to really try to put pressure. And I mean, that's only a tactic that in itself doesn't achieve anything, but if masses of people do it, I think the pressure placed on the political system could be so significant that, things start to really change. At least that's the vision. The hope that we will declare that cities, states, countries will declare a climate emergency and start really looking into seriously what needs to be done.
Putting our bodies on the line for all life.
Yes, for all life, all species, for the whole earth and all its creatures. Yep.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So should we open it for discussion, Chelsea? Questions, discussions? Brilliant input.
Obviously, yeah, totally up to you all, but I'm sure everyone with us tonight would enjoy that.
I'm ready.
All right. Well, lovely then. So as you all have heard, we will now open it up for discussion. We ask that when you unmute yourself, that you say who you are and where you are visiting us from. Again, I will give everyone the option to unmute themselves, and you can do that by the little microphone at the left bottom corner of your Zoom screen. We do ask, though, because a lot of background noise can be picked up, that if you are done talking, or just, right before, you wait until the person before you is done until unmuting yourself. So we try to mitigate that. Feel free, if you don't want to participate via audio or voice, that you can write into the chat box, and I'll be watching that, and I can ask any questions as well. And then just be mindful of each other and keep your comments on topic and within a respectable length, because we do want everyone who wants to participate tonight to have the opportunity to do so. So thank you all, and I will give you all the option to unmute yourselves.
Anybody?
For those who are new to this, sometimes silence feels a little uncomfortable, but these are pretty deep topics. So if there's a bit of time, till you feel ready to talk, that's fine.
Mm.
Don't feel like you have to rush right in on anything. Silence works too.
David,
Yes. Hi.
is it me? This is Rick.
Hi, Rick.
Hi. I had a question about the fact that people who really feel deeply about the climate and ecological catastrophe often feel very deeply a sense of grief about what they perceive happening. Could you say something about the relationship between grief and compassion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important question. Maybe we should mention this is Rick Visser calling in from Longmont, which is just the town next to where I live. And Rick and I are good friends and both members of the local Denver Extinction Rebellion group. This whole question of grief, I tend to think of it in terms of, I suppose in contrast with hope. You know, it's like there's something dangerous about hope insofar as it's part of a dualism, hope versus despair, and the problem of how we can kind of bounce around from one to the other. Maybe we read something in the newspaper that gives us some hope, and then we read something later that takes it away, and we tend to despair. And I think it's pretty clear in Buddhism that the path is not about bouncing back and forth. It's not about hope versus despair, but rather I think what we need now is real grief. I think we're all traumatized. We're all at some sense in denial. It's like we know things are quite bad and we don't know what to do. The tendency is to kind of repress it in some way and to sort of go on as if the kind of lifestyle that we've been experiencing is going to continue indefinitely. And I think in order to overcome that kind of cognitive dissonance, that kind of resistance, I really think we have to face our grief. And the grief here of what's happening to the earth, what's happening for the next generations. This is something we're going to have to face and be transformed by. You know, Buddhism has so much to say about suffering, and the path really isn't about evading our suffering, but facing it and being transformed by it. And I think a major part of our suffering for us today, when we realize what's actually happening to the earth, is to find ways to confront this grief and to not run away from it, not repress it, but somehow be transformed by it. What do you think? I mean, those are just some thoughts about grief. Would you add something to that, Rick?
Well, I just had this sense today that perhaps it's only when we face grief head on, in its fullness, that we open ourselves to real compassion. That only when we do that fully and honestly and without hesitation, that we can move forward with a compassionate action in the world. We're not denying anything, we're not pretending it isn't so. We see things in a sense as they are, and it's the truth. And without that, I think my intuition is that this is almost the same thing as compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're of the same substance in some way. That's a guess, and that's why my question.
Mm-hmm. No, that sounds right to me. That's what's called for. And in terms of what the loving awareness is able to achieve. I mean, it's in one way it's necessary, but it's also dangerous to get sort of caught up in trying to get somewhere rather than being here and now, expressing, feeling that loving awareness, which naturally calls forth compassion. And I think you're exactly right that the grief, which I think all of us to some degree are afraid of, that's something that the path goes through that, the spiritual path and the path of activism.
I think it's really important because it's so difficult to deal with grief. If you might discuss a little bit about how grief can transform us.
Well, within the Buddhist tradition, we have this wonderful example of Joanna Macy, who has really created workshops that can help people that can help people do that. Now, she used to call them despair and empowerment workshops. That was a long time ago. Now she talks about the work that
reconnects.
The work that reconnects. Thank you. And so she, more than anybody, I think, is the one not just talking about this, but actually providing a way for people to do it. One of the interesting things about it is it starts with gratitude. You know, it's like if we don't ground ourselves in gratitude to the natural world, gratitude to other people, gratitude to all the Earth's beings, then once we start to encounter the grief, I think we can be blown away much more easily. So I think she has a really important insight there about by grounding ourselves in gratitude and also feeling, you know, gratitude is a way that we reconnect. It's like when say, if I go out in the natural world and I'm by myself and I'm sitting under a tree, feeling gratitude is grounding myself in that place insofar as I feel connected to it. And there's a kind of empowering that goes along with that. So that's kind of the foundation of the transformation for her. Yeah. In her workshops, and she talks about these in a number of books. The most recent one, I think, is Active Hope, but she talks a lot about the different stages. I'm trying to remember. This is in the book somewhere. Basically, I'm deflecting your question because she's the one who's really able to help us do that. I think that given the kind of crisis we have today, given the particulars of it, one thing I think that can be really, really helpful is going out into the natural world and spending time there. Right? And so many of the great spiritual teachers have done that. Not just the Buddha, who had this special thing with trees. You know, he was born outside in Lumini Grove. When he left home, he went into the forest. He did his studying and ascetic practices, his enlightenment, his meditation. He mostly lived in the forest. He died between two trees. I mean, he had some real connection there. And not just him. I mean, think of Jesus going off into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, or Muhammad's cave. It's like, it really seems to be very, very transformative, getting away from our usual utilitarian way of naming and using everything, seeing everything as a utensil for something. If we can actually go off by ourselves and open up to what the natural world has to offer, then I think, especially right now, part of that transformation, I think naturally, will include, based on this foundation of gratitude, the getting in touch with our despair, or sorry, not despair, with our grief. Getting in touch with we're all repressing it. We're all traumatized. We're all pushing it away. But in that kind of environment, I think it can help us to open up to that.
And one other thing that might help people some is you're talking about hope and despair being a duality. And that if you have hope and then you see something bad news, you go into despair. back and forth. This hope almost causes despair in that sense.
Right.
And then you have hope again. How do Buddhists work between those two, and what position do we work to maintain?
Right. Well, that's why I emphasize grief, frankly. Grief, a grief that sort of allows us to put that duality of hope and despair sort of on the side. And that's also why I emphasize acting without attachment to the results, doing the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do is going to make any difference. It's again, so that's not about hope and fear, that's about responding appropriately as we can.
Right.
There's a wonderful Zen koan where the student asks the master, what's the constant activity of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas? And the master answers, well, it's very simple, responding appropriately. So moment by moment, we respond appropriately with loving awareness. It's not about hope and despair. It's about acknowledging our own grief, being transformed by that, and then doing the very best we can moment by moment, not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing what that will lead to, because there is a kind of a fundamental mystery there. And I think that's the other thing to emphasize in Buddhism is the world is essentially a mysterious place. In some ways, things look very bad, but we don't really know what's happening. We don't really know what's possible. You think about the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union. Remember that? I mean, who saw that coming? I mean, it's just sort of, things can turn on a dime sometimes. Yeah. Nelson Mandela, one day he's in prison on an island, the next day it seems he's president of South Africa. Okay, it wasn't a day, but it was pretty quick. So the Buddhist path isn't about understanding everything, it's about opening up to this mystery. And this applies to the larger ecological crisis. We don't know what's going to happen, for sure. We don't know how things are going to unfold. But what's clear is our path, which is to say, moment by moment, responding with loving awareness, acting appropriately as we can. And it really seems to me at this point that one of the important ways to do that is being part of a movement that will hopefully grow very quickly of people willing to put themselves on the line to defend the earth and all its creatures.
So other people, comments, questions, Linda, Marta, Chelsea, Joanna.
I'm here.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm not Greg. I'm Jennifer. What you were just talking about, the loving awareness, and then Susan, the taking the middle road in our actions, and then awareness and consciousness. And if we can even do, a minimal amount of helping other people along the road to awareness, that for me seems to be a really good path, one path, and in a gentle, loving way as best we can. And I have heard that and this brings me great hope, that there has been a tipping point of consciousness and awareness, and so that there is more of that coming to people, more consciousness, more awareness, and as much as we can help that, I think is a really positive direction. You agree?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a tipping point yet, but I do feel things are moving in that direction very quickly, that there is some waking up going on, the realization that we've really got to do stuff, and especially among young people, right? You think of Greta Thunberg and all the school strikers, realizing that, wow, what kind of world are we going to, what kind of world are we old fogies going to be leaving for them, and realizing that they just can't sit around and do their math homework, that they've really got to look into that. So in a way, that to me is the most hopeful thing of all. Yeah. I mean, Buddhism traditionally is one of the spiritual paths that focuses on developing our awareness. You can call it expanding our awareness, or realizing that our awareness is deeper than ego, or there's a lot of ways we can talk about it. I also think it's important to keep in mind what we were saying about the Bodhisattva path, that awareness in and of itself, important as that is, it has to be expressed in how we actually live in the world. And in some ways, that's the more difficult task, thinking about the days when I lived in some meditation centers. If you meditate really hard, or, if you're working hard, insights, personal transformations, in some ways, they're not that difficult. The more difficult thing, at least for me, was leaving those centers, going out, relating to people, and actually integrating the insights that sometimes happened in how I actually live in the world. And I think what we're faced with now, of course, is not just doing that on the individual level, but looking for ways to challenge institutions and to challenge the kind of mainstream consciousness that somehow thinks that the kind of society and economy we have can keep on going the way that it is. So I guess awareness, yes, but awareness engaged. I guess that's what I'm pointing to. I mean, there are some people who've said that it's enough just to meditate and to change ourselves, and then that will sort of affect the people around us and it will spread. And that's certainly where we start for Buddhists, but that's insufficient. The idea that it's simply enough to happen on that level, certainly that's much too slow given the kind of situation we find ourselves in now. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, not too much is fascinating, but let's see if someone else wants to say something.
Susan, can you hear me?
Yes,
Susan?
we can. Hi, Linda.
Hey, well, hi. It's hard for me to be quiet, so I'm so thrilled to dive in. First thing I want to say, I so applaud and thank you for your work. It's so so wonderful. And I love the fact you just said, expanding our awareness. And I know that part of, tell me if you agree, that part of expanding our awareness in the spiritual community as advocates and activists, part of that expanding that awareness is to grow up and understand that despair, this hopeless wave of hopelessness that comes over us, those of us who are not in denial, accept that not, as our culture tells us, is some sort of psychological illness, but this is all of this, we are finally, hopefully, becoming mature enough to realize that these are things that are part of the normal human spectrum of emotion. And we don't need to take drugs or whatever to calm us down and make us quiet, but we need to accept and work through that. And I'm wondering, is that what you're trying to do? Because I'm wildly excited about this Ecodharma. Is that part of that expanded consciousness that is now getting out into the streets, but in a loving, compassionate way? I just would love to hear you just say a bit more about that, because I would like to take that and run with it in my work.
I think that it's easy for us to confuse despair with grief, and I think they're somewhat different. The problem with despair, the way it's usually understood, is there's something very disempowering about it. It's like despair, I can't do anything.
Yeah.
It's all over, right? And that's not what I'm talking about. It's like when I talk about grief, look, if we don't feel grief, we're living in a fantasy world. We're not paying attention to what the hell's going on. And of course, most people are, let's be honest. But to feel the grief, that's a very, very uncomfortable emotion. But to open up and to feel that, then there is a kind of empowerment. Because what I love about grief is that it cuts through, it cuts through all the bullshit of our lives. It's like it cuts through the old ego habits of the things that, you know, we normally spend our time that are important for us. And when we really feel the grief, it can just liberate us from all that and really clarify what's important, you know, what's important in my life, for someone like myself, what do I want to really do for the rest of my life? And so in a funny kind of way, the grief, which we're also terrified of and we repress it, it's actually the most empowering thing if we can open up to it. And so, see, the interesting thing about the Bodhisattva doesn't know for sure what's possible.
Right.
You know, you need to be intelligent. You sort of figure out as best you can what would be something good to do. But it's really kind of just like one step at a time. So here in Denver, you know, we're doing some activities. Right. If you've been following the news in London, what the people are doing, blockading downtown London and so forth. Who knows for sure what that's going to lead to? Right. But there are fruitful possibilities there. So the idea of the Bodhisattva is somebody, well, here's the other thing to say. As referring to Buddhist practice, as we begin to wake up and realize our non-separation, that we're not a self separate from the world whose well-being is separate from the world, as we begin to open up to that, then it involves a kind of fundamental transformation in the meaning of our lives. I mean, as long as we have this strong sense of separate self, to a large extent, our life is going to be, what's in it for me? You know, that's going to be the meaning of our lives. Okay, I'm trying to be successful in whatever way I think I need to be successful. But as far as we open up on this path to the mystery, to the grief, to what's happening, this transformation of meaning, it's like, okay, what's the meaning of my life? The meaning of my life is doing what I can to make the world a better place. And right now, that means doing the best we can to actually engage with the ecological crisis, without having any delusions that we know exactly what needs to be done, but engaging with loving awareness, trying to do intelligently the very best we can, knowing that we're going to feel frustrated a lot of the time, things won't work out, but with the training and non-attachment to results, we can cope with that and go on to the next thing. Sorry, I went off in a spiel. Does that help at all? Does that make sense?
Oh, no, that's what we wanted. Thank you. No, it's brilliant. Thank you so much.
If you get a chance, look at the last chapter of the book. Sorry, I'm sorry to plug in the book.
I can't wait to read the book. I can't wait to read it.
It talks a lot more about the Bodhisattva path. The other thing in my website, davidloy.org, you can read the introduction for free, and it gives you a summary of the whole book. In fact, if you don't want to buy the book, just read the summary introduction, and that'll give you some idea what the book's about.
So I support my fellow kindred spirits, but if I may just say something very quickly. That happened to me today. I'm down in Florida visiting my sister, and I was over at the Conservation Center for Sea Turtles down here. And so I was hanging out with rescued sea turtles, and we were talking about, you know, veterinary medicine, wildlife veterinary medicine, and blah, 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 as they got a call to come and see if they could help rescue a sea turtle that was about 50 yards out with a fish net on it. And so we all went racing. And I said, oh, great, you know, and they said, oh, ex-wildlife vet, come on. Well, to make a long story short, there wasn't anything we could do at the moment. And I felt the pain and the suffering of this creature combined with my own. And as I walked back to my friends on the beach, I was just in tears.
Mm.
But they were tears of, you know, grief or whatever, but they were also tears of resilience, that I knew this is how I feel now, but oh boy, when I get up off my knees, wow. And the point is not that about me. It was how it affected the people I was with.
Mm. Tears of love.
That's what was powerful to them. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
No.
Tears of love. Yeah. So I just want to say to everybody, don't be afraid to shed tears of love. Yeah.
That sounds like the Bodhisattva path to me, responding appropriately with loving awareness. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Vinny, Joanna, Linda, any of you like to speak?
I don't know if you can hear me, can you?
Yes, we can.
I wrote a note there.
Yeah.
I've been talking a lot about this with several friends, and what I find is that a lot of people who are really coming into a spiritual life are really afraid to learn how to become active. And I think it's not enough anymore to just, I think it's great and I enjoy it and I love getting together with a group of people to send energy to the earth or to some tree or someplace in the world, but it's not enough. And I think we've got to start breaking it down, how to teach people to actively get involved, even in a little way, especially people who are really working and they've got other kinds of things going on in their life. I'm retired now, right? So I have a whole lot of time. And people who are professional or people who like you or David or Linda, spend a lot of your life doing that. But so we need to depend on the people who are working in the world to spend their free time becoming really involved. And I'm not sure how exactly to go about doing that other than to talk to people about small ways of doing it. You know, find a cause, learn about it, really understand it and be able to talk about it and push it a little bit. So that's really all I want to say is that I'm just really coming into that perspective that we really just have to be able to encourage people to step out of their shell of just worrying about it. And I'm still stumped about how to quite do that.
Yeah, it was interesting today. I was watching some videos about the London action, and you know, because they were occupying bridges and important sites, it was really blocking traffic. And the Guardian website had a fascinating video where they were talking to a lot of people in trucks and cars, Canary Wharf, which is the center of the financial district. But the people they interviewed, it was quite striking, rather than the expectation that I had of, you know, they're really angry at these folks. You know, I've got to get to my, almost everybody was expressing, you know, yeah, I'm going to miss my meeting, but they were also saying, you know, we've got to do this. We've got to do this. And there was the realization in every case that I can remember that, yeah, these people who are blockading, it's like business as usual is going to lead to collapse. So how do we block business as usual? What do we do to shake people up? And maybe massive civil disobedience is something that can shake that up and encourage people to think more about the world that their children and their grandchildren are going to be living in. But I mean, I also deeply share your concerns, and I have to say, within the Buddhist world, I've been quite surprised and somewhat frustrated over the last year. I thought Buddhists would be more open to this, and Buddhists are like everybody else. They seem to be as resistant. You know, in Buddhism, we have our own ways of dealing with the trauma. We meditate, helps us repress it, or you know, we gain some peace of mind through that so that we can kind of ignore what's going on. Or else some Buddhists, more traditional ones, think of the path as about escaping this world. You know, nirvana is transcending this reality in some way, and so you don't worry about it so much. So within the Buddhist community as well. It's not as though these ideas are really bearing fruit in the way that I think they need to do. More and more teachers are, I think, waking up, but there's still quite a bit of resistance. And of course, when I say Buddhism, you can translate that into a lot of other sort of spiritual paths, yeah, as well. So yeah, the work is cut out for us, and I'm curious to see how much the book may prompt more people to be open to something like that, but it remains to be seen.
Is there anyone else who'd like to speak?
Yeah.
If I could add something.
You may.
This is in response to Joanna Wolf. I appreciate your comments, and I think I feel some of the concern and perhaps anxiety that you're expressing. And I just wanted to say a couple words about Extinction Rebellion. It's not an organization, it's a movement, and it's completely decentralized. And you don't need permission to do anything whatsoever from anybody. So if you are in Cozad, Nebraska, and there's only 2 people in your whole community who feel the same way you do, and you agree to the 4 demands in the US, and the 10 principles. The principles are basically nonviolence is number 1 and overrides everything else, and no blaming and no shaming of anybody in the group. And if you go along with the basic 3 or 4 demands, depending on where you are in the world, then you can do anything you want in Extinction Rebellion's name. You can say you are Extinction Rebellion at that point. So you don't need to go to Central and get permission to do anything. You don't have to have a large group to do anything. You can just go ahead and glue your hand to a tank or block the traffic on the main intersection, whatever you feel that you want, or just make a sign and sit on the floor like Greta Thunberg did. And it made a huge global impact all by herself. She didn't try to attract the media. She didn't know the strategy of what to do and what not to do. She didn't take any training. She just sat down in great humility, but extraordinary persistence, and would not be moved. And so she's moving all of us. So I just wanted to add that. So no permissions needed. Just go on to their website and print out their demands and principles and go for it. One person, hey, that's all I am. Just go do it. Thanks.
Nice. We're nearing the end of the hour. Is there anyone else who hasn't spoken who would like to?
Hi, it's Linda.
Hi, Linda.
Hi. I was wondering if there is a place within this movement for those people who just would like to show compassion and love and try to move along that path. I've been studying the Dalai Lama for a very long time, and I'm a little, I don't know, I'm a little uncomfortable with the activism, and that's just me. It's just me. I just find it more easy to just try the acts of kindness and to love the earth. And do you think that that is a significant way through the movement? Is that helpful?
Yes, I mean, I think that's exactly what's called for. Frankly, I suspect, I mean, I've read quite a bit of the Dalai Lama too over the years, and I doubt very much that he would criticize something like Extinction Rebellion. I think he might be very sympathetic to that. But certainly what he would emphasize is what you said, the idea of loving compassion, and that's what needs to be cultivated, and that's what we cultivate in our, say, meditations. But if we do that, when we stand up from our cushions and we go out into the world, this loving compassion, it's not just something, a feeling, it's something that wants to express itself.
Right.
It's something that wants to manifest in the world. So we step outside our house or we go out into society. How does it want to manifest? And that's the compassion that Rick was talking about earlier. But compassion in and of itself as some kind of abstract thing doesn't mean very much. The real challenge is, how does compassion manifest? What are we doing in the world that's expressing compassion, right?
Right.
I mean, compassion literally means suffering with, right? Going back to the passion of Christ, the sense of the suffering. And when we open up to what's really going on, we feel the suffering of other people. We feel the suffering of the earth. We feel the suffering of other animals and species. And that calls upon us to act in a certain way. So that's really what we're talking about. We really are talking about an activism grounded in that. But if it's genuinely grounded in that, there will be a spontaneous compassion that wants to find ways to manifest itself and to find ways to respond to kind of the suffering that's happening right now. So again, can we have an activism grounded in love and compassion? And I think we can, and we have to, but I remember a story Bhikkhu Bodhi once told me where he said, there are people who sort of do metta meditation in Buddhism, and they'll maybe go off by themselves to a cabin, or they'll go to a meditation center. Metta meditation is loving kindness meditation. So it's all about generating loving kindness for the people you know, your close friends, and then extending it to everybody, including even quote unquote enemies. Extending this, just feeling this compassion for everyone. And then he says, maybe they do this in a retreat, and then they go home and they return to their usual lives. And he said, well, wait a minute, something's missing there, right? It's not, the metta meditation transforms us, it makes us, it gives us more loving awareness, but how does that actually manifest in the world? What are we, how are we expressing it in terms of what's going on, all the suffering in the world? And I think he's really got an important point there. The abstract feeling, the feeling I love everyone. Okay, well, that's very nice, but what does it really mean if it's not embodied and expressed? It's kind of, it has no meaning. It has no power. Does that make any sense?
Yes. But I even go out into my garden and I talk to my plants and Mother Earth. And it's not just that I go out there and say I love everybody, because some days I don't. But it's an expression from me to Mother Earth and every leaf and flower that I try not to step on. And that's what I'm saying. I'm sure it's not as effective, but it could be a little effective.
And I just want to jump in really quick and notice that we are at the hour. So David, if you're able to stay on a little bit longer and answer that question,
sure,
that would be wonderful. But I do want to be conscious to everyone who may have to leave us, and just kind of offer a closing of the space and an honor of their time tonight. Thank you, everyone who joined us. Tonight was so wonderful for me and, all this, the Earthfire community. It felt like the direct mission of these conversations. How do we bring this change in perception and practice into action? So hearing everyone talk about it and care so deeply is so inspiring. So thank you to David, and thank you to Susan and everyone who joined us tonight. These conversations, as I said, are recorded and will be on our website. And I will also send out a thank you with some of the resources that David has talked about. The best way to keep in touch with us is through our newsletter, which you can find on our website. And then just a note for our May conservation conversation, it will be on May 22nd, which is actually the 4th Wednesday in May, and not the 3rd. And that's because there's 5 of those. So again, thank you for everyone. If you're able to stay on longer, it sounds like we're willing, but I do just want to acknowledge and say thank you to those of you who have to go.
Thank you for that, Chelsea. Yes, yes. And people can just switch off when they have to go, but I'm very happy to continue. And I think what was just said was very important. That I mean, I just wanted to make a quick response that Rick and I have talked quite a bit about Extinction Rebellion and the importance of direct action, nonviolence, but we wouldn't want to give the impression that somehow that's the only appropriate response. It's like people are in different situations, and you know, what's going to be appropriate for some people may be very appropriate for others. So I really appreciate your comment about going out into the garden. I mean, that's not to say that that's not also important. That different people are going to be responding in different ways. Yeah, and we don't need for everyone to respond in exactly the same way. Yeah.
Can I add something to that? Can I add something to that?
Go ahead, Rick.
Linda, I really appreciated your comments because I too am a gardener. And I have a close relative who is dear to me. And when I told her what I was doing, she said, Rick, I cannot go there. I just can't do it. I'm just going to take care of the people in my immediate life as best I can. And I said, do that. Just stay with that. It is the best thing you can do. That's what you do. In my own garden, it means a great deal to me. And I just planted a bed of fava beans, cover crop. And I thought, this bed, you know, I dedicate it as the whole world. And this is the whole world, these fava beans, because they draw carbon out of the atmosphere and they sequester it down into the soil. They take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and bring it into the soil. They bring nutrients deep from the deepest soil back up toward the surface where it can be used. And then I can cut it down when it blossoms, and the pollinators will enjoy it while the bloom is there, and then I can cut it and turn that into compost. So to me, that bed is like I dedicated to all sentient beings.
Yes.
Okay? And when I go out there and stand by it, it brings me to tears just to be by that bed. It's just, the whole garden is that way because the garden includes the sky above it and the earth beneath and all the trees. I would say, and you can't get yourself to be an activist right now. Just go with that and be 100% confident that that's the best thing for you to be doing.
Heartfelt thank you. Heartfelt thank you. Thank you very much.
Anybody else want to come in here, or I mean, have we really solved all the Earth's problems, or?
Chelsea, I'm going to head off. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Right. I appreciate what you're doing very much. It's very important.
Thanks, Rick.
All right.
Yeah, much appreciated.
So I'll close the space then.
Thank you.
And, you know, we can't have you on again, David.
Well, let's give people a little bit of time, but we'll see. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's lots to talk about. Yeah.
So I'm going to say good night then for everybody and close the space.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much, Susan and Chelsea, for doing all the work and creating this space for all of us to come together like this. Deep appreciation to you for this and for everything else that you do.
Thank you, David. Conservation Conversations are a production of the Earthfire Institute, a wildlife sanctuary and rehabilitation center whose mission is to change how people see and therefore treat wildlife and nature. Join us as we work toward becoming a committed and supportive community of all beings. Earthfire depends on your donations to continue these conversations. You can donate at our website, www.earthfireinstitute.org. The soundscapes are by Wild Sanctuary Presents, Bernie Krause and Philip Arberg. Thank you for listening. Please join us for these monthly conversations.